Welcome to this episode of The World According to Irina Tsukerman, our very special series on global politics on the KAJ Masterclass Live. Irina Tsukerman is a US-based national security and human rights lawyer as well as a renowned geopolitical analyst. Her writings and commentary have appeared in diverse US and international media and have been translated to over a dozen languages. And every fortnight in The World According to Irina Tsukerman, we traverse the geopolitical landscape and delve into pressing international issues and gain insight from Irina's expert perspective. Welcome to the show once again, Irina.
Thank you so much. Glad to be here.
Absolutely, absolutely. It's a special occasion in that sense. This is the 50th episode of The World According to Irina Tsukerman on KAJ Masterclass Live. So this is is very special. It takes a lot of, effort, especially from you, Irina, to this. This means we have almost completed 2 years plus in that sense because it's a bi-weekly episode in that sense. So it's a very special occasion. Also from that perspective and also from that, that we have been talking about. This helped me also get updated, know about your insights and also get updated on all the happenings, political happenings across the world. So I have learned a lot in this whole series, all throughout Irina. Otherwise, generally, doing other shows and all, I would not be able to know about it. It has improved my knowledge and it has impacted so much in what I do. So thank you once again, Irina, for that.
And thank you for the opportunity. I've really enjoyed it as well. It's always been thought-provoking and fascinating.
Right. So for the viewers, we will be certainly taking it, much more higher in the days to come with lots of things to do, much more consolidation and putting a lot of emphasis on this particular show. And so we will be talking about so many news today to talk about. But first, breaking news, about the assassination of Charlie Kirk. And then there is this whole attack on Hamas by Israel. And obviously, we'll touch on the Nepal developments first. So whichever one you want to take first, Irene.
Well, let's start with Nepal. I think it's actually a story that's been somewhat covered in the Western media, but not nearly enough, because it hasn't really been a huge it hasn't been a huge part of geopolitical landscape here. It received a lot more attention in Asia, but essentially, to explain a complicated situation simply, the protests in Nepal are basically driven by Gen Z, very young people. It's the most violent domestic unrest in decades. The flashpoint being a social media ban that created a huge uproar. The government moved to shut down access to major platforms, including Meta, Facebook, X, YouTube, LinkedIn, which is a professional networking platform, Reddit, Signal, which is a private chat known to be very secure, and Snapchat. The reason for that is the alleged failures to register under new regulations. Now, I'm not entirely sure whether all of these companies that are all have different ownership and different management from each other have even been notified of these regulations. Regardless of the technicalities, the youth which uses these platforms for connections felt repressed. They saw it not as a regulatory step, but as a repressive censorship targeting their freedom of expression and exposure to grievances about nepotism, about elite privilege. So what began as digital outrage online with masses of young people expressing their concerns turned to the streets, and tens of thousands of young people participated into these demonstrations. The security forces responded with tear gas, water cannon, rubber bullets, and even with live fire eventually. violence broke out. The demonstrators also engaged in acts of violence, reportedly setting buildings on fire and causing deaths, including among former politicians in Nepal. Dozens of protesters also were killed. Scores were wounded in clashes around the parliament building in Kathmandu. And the situation kept escalating ever since then. Government buildings were being taken over and damaged, courthouses, party offices, and even private residences belonging to the political leaders were being set on fire. The stores were being shuttered due to the unrest. The roads were emptied of cars and pedestrians. And in fact, the government sent out army units to assume control of the streets under curfew conditions. Prime Minister Sharma Oli resigned as the government lost control of the situation. And many see it as a complete breakdown in state authority. Meanwhile, at the same time as this political collapse was going on, nationwide security collapse was taking place at the same time. There were inmate uprisings in various prisons taking place simultaneously, as if they were coordinated. Over 13,500 prisoners escaped within 24 hours amidst completely chaotic conditions. Many of these prisoners are reportedly wanted in India, which is another reason why this unrest attracted so much attention. They also had some of them also had transnational criminal ties, which caused particular alarm in border regions such as Bihar and Uttar Pradesh. Looting's been reported. Arson compounded the turmoil. There were attacks on billionaires' estates, on federal infrastructure, and even court records were not protected from the chaos, became collateral. The crisis kept spreading. The momentum of this youth movement only deepened public disillusionment with what they perceive as deeply entrenched and corrupt elites. The young people who are loosely organized but highly motivated are chanting slogans, which included something like "Stop corruption, not social media." The demands they put out included government accountability, transparency, and structural reform. The ban was eventually lifted, but the anger did not fully subside. Proposals surfaced to include the former Justice Sushila Karki as an interim leader. But while this idea surfaced, meanwhile, the constitutional order as a whole has been falling apart. Even royalist undercurrents that were present in the political discourse but were not particularly active in recent years were resurrected by this complete upheaval. There were some protests early in the year that may have been a precursor for the renewal of this discussion. They were already starting to gain a little bit of steam since then, because of, in part, chronic political instability. And some were even demanding the return of King Gyanendra under a constitutional monarchy, thinking that it could bring back some accountability around these elites. But these protests were separate from the Gen Z protests about the social media bans, but they sort of foreshadowed the deeper readiness inside the public for more radical institutional resets than very limited reforms that the government was willing to propose. And essentially, the signal from those protests were that in the absence of trust in the republic, nostalgia for monarchy could become a potent political pull. So what we see now is that Nepal is at a crossroads. What happens next really depends on how quickly a new authority can rein in the still ongoing and not completely lulled violence. Whether whoever comes next can bridge the generational divide and channel the fury among these Gen Z protesters into serious and lasting political reform rather than chaotic rebellion. The army now is patrolling the capital, the curfews are still in place, the dialogue is tentatively underway, but unless the root causes, which include, among other factors, not only the social media outrage, but youth unemployment, corruption, and what is perceived as political stagnation, unless all of that is urgently addressed, the threat of further collapse could be imminent. And neighboring countries, especially India, are of course deeply interested in what is happening. They're wary of spillover and uncertain about who, if anybody, ultimately emerges as the next stable leader in Nepal. So it's a strategic and security issue for India and not just an issue of idle interest or economic concern.
Absolutely, absolutely, Irina. A couple of questions here to understand this better, to make sense of it is, uh, it looks like to be, how should we understand? Is it like just it happened? Government took some step, it just happened, or there is much more beyond this story? Because seeing seeing what happened in Bangladesh, seeing what happened in Sri Lanka, for whatever reasons, how should we understand this? Means, was the government so oblivious of how the people will react by closing so many platforms at the same time? Obviously, it's not just about social media, it's about livelihood, because today people do their business on many of these platforms, people like it or not. But the same WhatsApp, people use it for business dealings, for other things also, LinkedIn and all these things. Help us understand from that point of view. Was the government so oblivious, or was there something much more beyond that meets the eye? Because all these things look, when you also talked about coordinated things happening and in a couple of places. Help us understand from that point of view.
There are two layers to this question. The first is always who benefits, and the second, who actually may have had a hand in any organization of the movement or in moving it in a particular direction. So, in terms of who benefits, obviously criminal networks and insurgent elements benefited quite well. Organized crime, smugglers, and even militants and terrorists have a larger pool of operatives due to the mass escapes. Um, uh, so such people always thrive in weak state conditions, and they exploit porous borders and overwhelmed police forces. They gain manpower, territory, and of course impunity when the state is forced to deal with the more immediate security needs. So they definitely benefit. Of course, the royalist movements, although they were not directly part of the youth protests, uh, look more appealing to parts of the population who are fed up with the current conditions, with factionalism, party elites, vacuum of leadership after the resignation of the prime minister. So the royalists stand to present themselves as a viable alternative and push a unifying figure above partisan chaos. Of course, another group of interested parties are political outsiders and populists, with the people with reputations that have been untarnished by the currently entrenched party system, such as the aforementioned Chief Justice Karki. Calls for an interim government led by technocrats or clean hands reflect public exhaustion with the same old story. And any populace who can channel this anger into a narrative of sweeping reform, whether they mean it or not, and whether they actually can fulfill it or not, can ride the wave of unrest into formal political authority. Regional powers, especially China. Now, India could potentially also benefit. it could gain leverage by offering stabilizing assistance, training, or border security cooperation. But that's only if things go well enough for such help to be actually welcomed by somebody serious. If not, the spillover is potentially damaging. And India could become a partner in defining political choices and helping direct the political transition. China, however, is a more immediate and obvious beneficiary because it can capitalize by presenting itself as a guarantor of order and infrastructure continuity, as it has attempted to do with Bangladesh. And it can push its Belt and Road projects under the guise of restoring economic stability. Now, the opportunity can bring Nepal closer to either side, but much depends on who ends up ultimately prevailing in shaping the direction of the country. And of course, these options are directly attached with each other. So India and China find themselves, despite recent rapprochement, at on the opposite sides of this issue. Another potential beneficiary here is the Nepali army. The politicians are now being thoroughly discredited. The police forces are stretched thin. The military is elevated to being arbiter order. The troops on the streets, they're in charge of enforcing curfews and emergency decrees. And that means that the army's hand in politics is being strengthened. If the civilian factions remain paralyzed, the military could emerge as the de facto guarantor of national stability, gain influence over future constitutional arrangement, policy making, and even propel one of their own as the future leader of the country. So we could see sort of a military order emerge. Finally, of course, the youth movement itself could benefit. While these activists trigger the chaos, if they can actually pivot from protest to institution building, they would be the direct beneficiary of an improved situation. The sheer scale of the demonstrations showed that they have the capacity to organize at scale and that they're politically relevant. If they can transform outrage into structured political representation, they could force reforms on corruption, governance, transparency, and to seize the moment and become a dominant political generation. However, all of those, however, it is an optimistic view of the situation. A more sober view requires examining whether or not any parties had a hand in galvanizing these protests and triggering the chaos in order to reach power. Of course, obviously, the disillusioned youth movements took the direct part, but did they organize themselves? Of course, they had grievances, they had the network, social media, even after bans through VPNs and encrypted apps, of course, continued to function, and they had the anger over corruption. Initially, the protests did appear spontaneous, but the speed of mobilization, tens of thousands converging within hours, suggests some degree of coordination by activist circles already seasoned from earlier climate strikes, pro-democracy campaigns, and anti-corruption movements. While many of these young people may not have planned the chaos, they were primed to lead it once a spark was it was lit and the spark appeared. Now, another factor which could be as much of a driving force as these experienced political activists are rival political factions. For those who are not familiar with Nepal's ruling order, the parties there are notoriously fragmented. There's deep internal rivalries inside the communist bloc and between former monarchist, Republican, and Maoist cadres. It's entirely plausible to believe that opposition figures quietly, or maybe not so quietly, encourage demonstrations, financed logistics, or even amplified anger online through troll factories, bot networks, or simply by boosting youth activist voices online with the hope to weaken the prime minister and the government. The timing of the protests at the height of an unpopular social media ban was did create a perfect storm and an ideal opportunity for sideline factions to destabilize the ruling coalition, force resignations, which is exactly what they got. And now there may be a very wild scramble for power. Of course, the royalist networks may not just be beneficiaries, they could be some of those coordinating factions. They had already laid the groundwork for mobilization against the Republican system itself. The people who are sympathizing with the royalists are wealthy business families, disaffected elites who are not part of the ruling system, and networks nostalgic for the dynasty may have provided money and coordination channels to keep protests sustained. Because it's one thing to start something quickly, but it's difficult to sustain a movement once the government starts cracking the whip. Their long-term aim is not just nihilistic cares for its own sake, but a delegitimization of parliamentary system and setting the stage for calls to restore the monarchy as an alternative. Now, some of the criminals who are benefiting may also have been part of the organizational structure of this protest. The fact that the eruption of prison breaks was nearly simultaneous is unlikely to be a mere coincidence. Some of these crime groups have ties across the Indian border and elsewhere, and they had every incentive to fuel the chaos and to overwhelm security forces. They could have embedded agitators inside crowds, orchestrating riots near detention centers, or bribing local guards. These crime syndicates could have organized mass jailbreaks, um, which gave them additional numbers that they needed to become a much more powerful social force. Instability for them is a business opportunity. It gives them freedom of movement and leverage over the state in some ways, and perhaps some of them are even looking to gain power to cut deals with either with the ruling government or with the competing factions, and actually either launder their reputations and become part of future governments, or to benefit from corruption and from corrupt arrangements in the process. Now, yet another factor that should be seriously considered is the involvement of external actors. Given the fact that Nepal is geographically positioned between India and China, it is highly vulnerable to influence operations. Of course, there are tools to amplify discontent through covert funding of civil society groups, media manipulation, leveraging diaspora networks. India is concerned about Chinese encroachment. It could prefer a weakened independent Nepal to a strong autonomous one, but it's also unlikely to rock the boat. Even if India cuts deals with some of the factions later in the process, it is concerned about spillover and the situation gain out of control. And even if it tries to gain control over the situation, it's unlikely to create a scenario where there is a likelihood it may not succeed. China, on the other hand, might see the unrest as a pretext for offering stability packages, investments, and pushing its own agenda much more directly, discrediting pro-Indian and pro-Western factions. And we have seen that China has already played that role in Bangladesh, although it even cut deals with the previous government as well. So China could be either one of the organizing and partnering countries, or it may have jumped on board at some point in the process and then helped coordinate the ongoing situation further. and amplified it in various ways. Finally, one more factor that is somewhat less familiar in the West these days, but decades ago was the height of the news during the Cold War, are the remnants of Maoist insurgencies. Some of these old timers were never fully reintegrated into civilian politics. For them, unrest is a chance to resurface, to reinvent revolutionary narratives that could resonate with the unemployed youth. They're familiar with underground networks and protest organizations, and that familiarity could easily be repurposed to help escalate demonstrations from peaceful marches to violent confrontations, arson, even murder, ensuring that the unrest becomes unmanageable for state authorities. And it's quite possible that there is some combination of all of the above: revolutionaries, criminals, and Chinese groups working together for the sake of unseating the prime minister, undoing the current government, and then figuring out the next steps as they go along.
Absolutely, absolutely, Irina. And one thing that comes to my mind is that scale of violence. People generally think youth brings change, but can youth bring so much of violence along for the year? Was there another way out of it, Irina? Or do you think it's a big moment for social media also? They will think people don't want us in so many cases, but here it looks like they want us desperately, that they can go to such extent for getting these things back in their lives. How do you see this whole thing? And in terms of the wider message across the world, in terms of, Generation Z, this is the first time we are calling it a Gen Z protest. Do you think, all across a lot of Gen Z people, they will think that they have, normally some people dismiss them as they are not very much, they are very much in their own world, but they can certainly start thinking we certainly can bring a lot of change in this world.
I think that there is almost a desperation to look for something new in a phenomenon that's actually as old as time. Because throughout history, young people have mobilized for various causes and played an important role in revolutions, uprisings, peaceful protests, violent protests. They're easily mobilized, they're idealistic, they're not experienced enough to be cynical or to really think about what happens next, and they want to voice their concerns, and they have the energy and the time to do it, so it's a natural fit for movements. We have seen the role of the youth in the Arab Spring, which also turned eventually violent when it was co-opted by Islamist forces. We have seen protest marches during the civil rights movement on campuses in the United States, which were also penetrated by pro-Soviet factions and also turned towards a violent direction. None of that is new. So the fact that people are trying to create that this is the first time young people have ever driven, an uprising, I think this is this can only work with people who've never studied history, even for the past few decades, much less centuries of upheavals, of historical upheavals. However, as with any group, any demographic, there are some young people who are entirely peaceful, there are some people who are prone to violence, and there are some people who can be driven to violence under certain conditions. For instance, if the government responds with force, then these people who would be normally content to just march could escalate. Some people will never escalate, they will leave, or they will be victimized by violence, or they will try to avoid it. Some people will eagerly run to instigate violence at the first opportunity, and some people are opportunistic or situationally violent. They end up being part of violence, or they may get mixed up with the mob but would not normally start anything themselves. With this third category of people, the likelihood of agitators penetrating them and actually starting violence or amplifying smaller clashes with the government is a very likely scenario. And I think it's while it's very tempting to say that this is, a youth movement against social media and corruption, because of these wider internal political and also even geopolitical factors, I think it's this situation cannot be simply either credited or blamed on the young. I think there are experienced people who knew what they were doing, knew how to fuel or to direct this energy into the direction that they were interested in, and I think they succeeded at that, as very often happens in such situations.
Absolutely, absolutely, Irina. It's a new world altogether. And in this new world, activist Charlie Kirk, he has been assassinated. How do you see that, as well as if the attack of by Israel on Hamas?
Now, let's start with Charlie Kirk. Just to make it clear, Charlie Kirk was not a violent activist, but he was a controversial one. He was a conservative activist, started out as a campus activist. He himself did not finish college. He was basically homeschooled Christian conservative with a kind of pro-religious approach. He kind of started out trying to build a conservative, traditional values-based movement across college campuses, and that movement then, as he kind of aged out of that age group, he kind of took the show on the road and started engaging older young professionals and others, and essentially creating a very viable political force that could be mobilized towards engaging young people in politics, registering voters, getting people elected to office. Very much a very traditional political thing, not so different from the Reagan activists who mobilized masses of people around the country to give Ronald Reagan overwhelming victories. And in the beginning, that's all it appeared to be. Kirk became increasingly popular. He was well respected and admired among the conservatives because he appeared to be fairly moderate. He also appealed to pro-Israel people because he was a vocal defender of Israel on stage, and many people credited him with changing their minds or educating them about Israel through debates. He engaged people of different points of views, which is somewhat unusual in our times. So again, the first years and the beginning of his movement were quite respectable, not all that controversial, but increasingly, because he was not someone who had because he was an activist and not necessarily a conservative thinker or conservatively educated leader, that energy quickly became channeled into increasingly more populist direction. And Charlie Kirk started repeating a lot of slogans that he, I don't think, ever fully grasped or understood. Some of them were not even domestic US political issues. He started commenting on a lot of foreign policy things that I doubt he really had a full grasp on, from Khashoggi related stories that were coming in from various activist circles to assorted other things. I really think he kind of lost the plot a little bit at some point, and instead of sticking to the things that he knew well and could do best, he started expanding his horizons, but in a way that was not substantiated by concurrent education. He was just becoming more active in causes that were far from his direct experience and his communication level. And I think he was manipulated by various people and eventually started gravitating towards increasingly polarizing media personalities, and started developing ambitions that were far away from his original goals. So eventually, I think Kirk started following people like Tucker Carlson and Candace Owens, who also started out being fairly conventional activists, but eventually revealed themselves to be at best opportunists, and at worst people with deep-seated biases and mercenary motives, who started spouting absolute nonsense, all sorts of bigotry, conspiracy theories, uh, anti-American rhetoric, favoring Russia, China, Iran, Hamas, terrorist organizations, Nazis, you name it, they started doing it. Now, Kirk never went that far. He never actually praised Nazis or anything like that, but he did start giving platform to Tucker Carlson and Candace Owens after they already became lost a lot of their reputation due to their views and new positions. And Kirk became a very integrated part of Candace Owens' network that links back across from US to internationally, Britain, France, and other Western countries, and has links to pro-Russian propaganda networks that likely have funding from sources that either launder Russian money or directly channel it. These networks helped Kirk spread his organization, Turning Point USA, to Turning Point UK. In other words, he became an international figure with the help of these characters. He also started changing his own tone on Israel as well as on other issues, became increasingly conspiratorial, increasingly critical. Whether or not he simply sold out for financial gain and access, whether or not he was manipulated into actually changing his mind and bought the Kool-Aid, or whether or not he was sort of with that sort of people all along and over time increasingly bought into it and became increasingly useful to them, all of that is not clear, and I'm not sure we'll ever know, given that he died at the age of 31 as a father of two very young children, as an internationally known figure who was mourned both by President Trump, who considered him a close ally, and by Prime Minister Netanyahu, who may not have followed the recent developments and knew him from his past as a vocal advocate for Israel. But between all of these things, he represents a very complicated figure who nevertheless never engaged in any acts of violence himself, nor endorsed some of the most radical discourse and the more radical violent tendencies that some of the increasingly normalized fringe far-right groups started exhibiting in the last few years. So when he came to speak at a university event in Utah, it is not surprising that he drew a huge crowd of people, but it also is not surprising that while he had his own security detail, the security at that event was not particularly vigorous. Utah is a very conservative, politically conservative state. It's a religious state. The crowd that Charlie Kirk drew were overwhelmingly admirers. It was not the kind of event where there were mass counter demonstrations of leftist protesters or assorted activists from radical causes. It was just a fairly standard and typical event of that type. And it's interesting that right before being shot from 200 yards with a rifle, Charlie Kirk was asked about the proliferation of mass violence and mass murders in the United States in recent years. And right after he answered that question, he was shot from a distance. It was a long distance shot. His security would not have been able to prevent it, and his security detail was probably fairly basic. I don't think they were trained to be able to scout out for long distance attackers. The individual ran through the crowd and was later video that appeared in the video running on the roof. The authorities took into custody one individual who was quickly released, then another one who they thought might have been the shooter, but who was also fairly quickly released. As of now, the assassin appears to be at large. From all appearances, it seems that the motive was political, but it increasingly seems that whoever it was not an amateur, but probably someone with at least a professional training. Maybe not a hired professional hired to execute this task, but at least somebody who has had some training, possibly former military or former police officer or security guard of some sort. Who knows? But somebody who could shoot from a distance and shoot. He shot Charlie Kirk in the neck, and he was brought to the hospital fairly quickly, but the injury was incompatible with life functions. He basically bled out and died. And it's somebody who was able to get through a crowd of people with a weapon quickly enough to make an escape and to escape with the videos on him and with the authorities after him. He managed to make himself scarce. So I don't think it's somebody who panics easily. It sounds like somebody who was prepared for this operation, who probably scouted out the venue and had a good idea of the type of environment that he or she would be facing, most likely, if I had to guess. So we are facing an unusual scenario. Usually in previous shootings of that type, the shooter was either killed or apprehended quickly. We have seen the past attempts on President Trump where the shooter was quickly dealt with, but this is not that instance. We are seeing a surprising scenario, and we are already seeing Russian propagandists trying to spin the narrative to favor their own agenda, claiming that he was assassinated by pro-Israel forces because he was turning against Israel and giving platforms to Tucker Carlson and so on and so forth. So clearly, there are going to be chaos agents who will try to capitalize on this atrocity. Who will try to discredit the U.S. legal system and who will try to turn people on each other for political reasons, and those are the direct beneficiaries of this act. This is yet another reason I'm concerned that this was not just some delusional, hater, obsessive with a particularly visible activist personality, but rather somebody from some organized cause looking to further that sort of polarizing agenda. That is my biggest concern, that something like that could easily be turned in a way that can get out of hand.
Absolutely. We'll have to wait and see how this develops. What was the message here, who benefits, and what other players are doing on this. What about the Israel developments, Israel's attack on Hamas?
This has been a highly unusual development because this is the first time Israel has attacked Qatar's territory. This happened one day after Hamas rejected the ceasefire plan proposed by the Trump administration, which Israel quickly accepted. And within days of President Trump's comments that demanding that Hamas release the remaining hostages or face the consequences. Now, there's no indication that the U.S. took any part in the planning of the separation. In fact, it sounds like many members of the administration were not informed about it and were kept out of the loop. But it does seem like the president was aware of it, and it does seem that the Qatari leadership was aware enough to, at the very least, keep out of the way and not participate in the meeting that was targeted by Israel. Now, according to Qatar, Hamas, and Arab media sources, these leaders were not themselves harmed. or at the very least, they were not killed. But there were 5 or 6 members of Hamas, lower ranking members, not the top decision makers, who did die. And it does appear that one member of Qatari security forces was also killed, so he must have been in the immediate vicinity of that event when that happened. Of course, Qatar and various other countries condemned the occurrence. Trump promised that this would never happen again on their soil. Trump distanced himself from this development naturally, but it also seems that he was disappointed with the fact that the top leaders who were supposed to be taken out appear to have survived. We have yet to see any evidence that they actually did survive, but they may have been gravely wounded, but in a condition that makes it more likely than not that they will survive, and that creates sort of a mixed message. On the one hand, it still sends a signal that Hamas members are not safe anywhere in the world, and even Qatar's sovereignty is not sacrosanct, because Qatar has refused to expel these leaders, to put them on trial, or to give them over to other countries to be put on trial. They, in fact, have encouraged Hamas for the past 2 years to keep the hostages and as leverage and not to release them, because they benefited from being mediators in the process, and it was in Qatar's interest to prolong the war as much as possible in order to gain the limelight and the political power that comes with the ongoing negotiations. But at the end of the day, it's a message for them as well. Maybe these Hamas leaders were not taken out this time, but you never know what can happen in the future. Interestingly enough, the reaction of Western countries was actually much more belligerent than Middle East world, probably because most of the Arab world actually would be secretly happy to see Hamas gone. It would put them out of an extremely awkward situation of having to pretend to be defending the people who claim to be representatives of the Palestinians. In reality, they're a group of violent dictators who are refusing to hold elections and have killed their opposition. I don't think anyone in most countries in the region are happy to have to deal with them, and I think Qatar too has irked several countries in the region enough that they're not particularly grieving over its sovereignty. In the Western world, the situation is different, because much of the Western world is a direct beneficiary of Qatari investments. Moreover, Hamas has presented itself as legitimate political leadership for so long that some countries are separating between the Hamas military wing on the ground in Gaza and the Hamas political wing in 5-star hotels in Doha, wearing suits rather than military gear, and attending international events, at least in some parts of the world, where they're not designated as terrorists. And some Western countries, despite the European Union's designation, still host, or until recently hosted, some of the Hamas figures. So some of these countries literally threatened Israel with a downgrade in relations and things like that. We are seeing a very harsh reaction, which is in a way hypocritical, because when the United States went into Pakistan, which was hosting Osama bin Laden, and did what it had to do, there was no international outrage about the violation of Pakistani sovereignty, for good reason. If you don't want your sovereignty violated, don't host terrorists and don't help terrorists. So the fact that Qatar has become the new Pakistan, not that the old Pakistan has ever fully gone away. Now you have two countries playing the same role and coordinating with each other on many issues. By the way, this actually underscores why there should be zero tolerance policy for hosting terrorist groups in general, and why you can avoid a lot of controversy and bloodshed just by putting serious political pressure on these countries from the very beginning, instead of taking their funding and essentially treating them as if they're part of international legal norms. We will see what happens next, but I think Israel made its position clear. It will no longer wait for the international community to do the right thing. It will try to force the Hamas leadership out of the way, because so long as they hide in international capitals and coordinate international activity and remain the face of the Hamas as a political movement, there will be no reason either to release the hostages or to stop the fighting, and more lives will be killed. And by the way, the same countries condemning Israel for their alleged violation of Qatari sovereignty had nothing to say about Hamas violating Israeli sovereignty by killing 6 people just days before this happened and wounding many others, or Qatar literally funding Hamas and violating Israeli sovereignty with a mass invasion and abduction and murder. So the fact that this double standard persists in the national community is one of the reasons why terrorism attracts so many people. It appears to be justified, socially acceptable, and appears to bear rewards not only in the afterlife but in this life as well.
Absolutely, absolutely. A lot of discord everywhere. Amidst all this, Prime Minister Modi, what as SCO meeting, China's top leadership as well as a lot of other leaders, including Putin. So how should we look at this whole SCO summit that happened very recently?
I would say that the SEO visit was much more about optics than it was about substance. And I'll get to the substance because it is important. There were some things that happened that are worth noting, but it was very clear that Prime Minister Modi was playing up his meetings with Xi and with Putin, not necessarily out of any personal great love for either of them, but to send a message to the United States and to the international community that India has options, that India is pursuing a multipolar foreign policy, and that it is not isolated or dependent on the U.S. Goodwill. What happened right before that, meaning a reported dispute over whether or not President Trump should be credited with the ceasefire between Pakistan and India, which led to a cooling in the communications between the two leaders, and eventually with Trump responding with the imposition of an additional 25% tariff on top of the 25% tariffs already imposed on India, despite ongoing trade talks, which are still ongoing, by the way. This has led to a wide perception that India was being singled out. It ended up with the highest tariff rate in Asia. In addition to that, there were additional visa-related restrictions that were being leveraged quite directly in a way that were not part of the negotiation process with other countries such as Japan, South Korea, and the European Union, and so forth, which also created a perception of bias and bigotry given the substantial positive economic role the Indian American community is playing in the US. Indian workers are playing in the development of sensitive technologies such as semiconductors that are highly dependent on foreign labor due to the skilled labor shortages in the United States, and many other positive related issues that created a huge popular backlash, also political backlash. And so this extremely warm language used in communications online, as well as body language, car rides, hand holding, and so forth, all of that was meant to send a very strong signal that US can lose India as an ally, even if Russia and China do not fully gain India as a close cooperating force, it is possible to lose them, and it is possible that at the very least those relationships can improve in a way that US does not particularly care for. And indeed, Trump seems to have acknowledged that message by saying, "Oh well, we lost India to the deepest, darkest China." Of course, the problem with that was that by we he meant himself, because he was the one responsible for the decision. It wasn't the country as at large that was responsible for that. There's been a great deal of business cooperation growing on the popular level, and I doubt anyone in the United States is happy about the major economic blow related to these tariffs. Now, regarding the substance, there were a number of issues that were discussed at the Shanghai Cooperation Organization gathering. Now, India's been a part of that gathering for a while. This is not news. The news is that Prime Minister Modi went to that event at that high level, and then he went to China, where he hasn't been in many years. So that's a radical departure from the previous posture, with India seeking to distance itself from China, suspending direct flights, restricting visits from China, and so forth. Now all of that is being undone by Trump's impulsive and highly personal reaction to a disagreement over the Nobel Prize issue. So what was brought up at SCO? Core interests are related to India and related to the competing blocks that it is now facing: counterterrorism, energy access, stable continental supply chains. This SCO setting allowed India to engage not only Russia but also Central Asian states on security, and a pragmatic position with China. Connectivity and finance played a major role in the discussions. There is an interest in developing issues concerning maritime choke points. There are dollar-centric frictions. There is an interest in developing practical cooperation on things like customs, digital payments, and logistic corridors. These things didn't catch as much attention as the speeches and the hand-holding and the mutual praise, but it's more important because those are the types of things that actually cement these relationships. India is likely to continue pushing for interoperable standards on cargo digitization, port call optimization with other member states, to reduce transit times, to insulate trade from sanctions blowback concerning the Russian oil purchases, and to lock in premium pricing for its services sector, as well as to strengthen rupee-linked transactions wherever it's feasible, because the rupee too has been suffering from devaluation in light of the recent developments. Now, there's the security topic is also signaling to Washington, to Islamabad, and even to Kabul. Afghani representation, Taliban, by the way, was interestingly absent from SCO, which is in itself a change, because up until now, there was always a consistent representation. India is leaning into no safe havens doctrine, which basically bundles cross-border insurgency, narcotics routes, and cyber-enabled financing under one umbrella. It's treating terrorism as a supply chain problem, and that allows India to justify broader intelligence sharing and maritime domain awareness projects with Central Asian partners in particular, even if the China factor complicates air and ground deployments, which means that despite that India can separate its bilateral disputes and differences with China from multilateral public goods and cooperation. Of course, technology and critical minerals are always a topic of such blocs and discussions. India has concerns about headline FDI announcements and terms of trades concerning semiconductors, battery inputs, and also grid hardware. If the SCO proves useful in normalizing long-term offtake agreements in such important resources as copper, nickel, and rare earths processing, India would gain leverage against tariff swings in other places like the US. The trade-off, of course, is in its ability to manage the optics of proximity to China. India is still prioritizing projects with Russia and the Central Asian countries that are not dependent on Chinese industrial policy, because at the end of the day, there is no love lost between the two countries. There's no trust, and India does not want to veer off away from the US to become dependent on China, which is by no means a better choice. Finally, there's also a domestic signal to its own audiences. Modi is underscoring that Indian strategic autonomy is compatible with tighter ties to the US and the Quad. There is no contradiction necessarily, but it's a hedge in the world of sanction cycles and weaponized interdependence. So India is not withdrawing from the Quad. In fact, right before SCO, Prime Minister Modi went to Japan, where he was very warmly received. He got a very symbolic cultural gift from the leadership there. He had top level meetings, and he formalized a number of agreements, pushed for mutual investments, a move that went very successfully. Strengthening relations with Japan is allowing a pursuit of Quad relations as well, without being dependent on the United States as the main architect of this structure. It doesn't. India is still signaling that it doesn't want to be dragooned into zero-sum blocks. It will transact where interests align, compartmentalize when they don't, and the stage at the summit is less a pivot per se than a platform for India's ongoing long game.
Absolutely, absolutely, Irina. Now, if I understand, a lot of good talks are expected between US and India over this trade tariffs and all. And if the messaging has been quite positive, especially on the social media part. So tomorrow, if all these things become normal, the tariffs are either withdrawn or come to a very nominal level. Do you think the gains from the SCO summit, especially with regards to India China, how do you see that? Will that be permanent? Will China deeply engage truthfully with India going forward?
I don't think China is an actor that India can or will trust. However, I also don't think that India will trust Trump to not suddenly raise the tariffs again, even if that issue is resolved in the near future to mutual satisfaction. I think the international community does not see the Trump administration as a whole, frankly, as a fully dependable actor, and I think this hedging is likely to continue, even if it's kept at manageable or minimal levels. I think India is not going to cut ties with China without some clear escalation or obvious provocation or discovery of some plot. Something like that could trigger a sudden cool down, but I think it will manage to try to keep the relations at the current level. I think it will lean into its relationship with Central Asian and Middle Eastern countries, and I think it will also try to balance out its relations with China against Chinese announcement of its deepening defense relationship with Pakistan, which I really think is the clearest signal yet that the love story with India is just not going to happen, no matter how many pundits want to make that work.
Absolutely, absolutely. The big question about Pakistan here is, should the common Pakistani people be, for more fall in love with what China has been to them, or whether they should fall in love with Trump's proposal that they will find oil in Pakistan? That's something, there's just a sort of a thing one will still very we wish all of them, in terms of that whatever happens for everyone's good, be that as it may. Let's move on to this whole, even with the visa thing itself, with regards to trade tariffs between India. What is your sense? Where does this meeting will actually lead to? Do you sense that there will be a, some sort of a better ties, because Trump, as usual, he will change his mind, bring in some respite to Indian traders who are looking for 50% is too much? Do you think it will be 10%? How do you see this whole, positive atmosphere that is being created for the upcoming meet on this?
Well, I have to say things in the US are not going all that great despite Trump's promises. The jobs report has been abysmal. There are reports of businesses going, losing, having to shut down on a daily basis. There are multiple states that are close to Trump's base that are suffering significantly. And quite frankly, there is a shrinking labor opportunity because of the stagnating economy. Ironically, none of that has actually resolved the trade deficit issue that Trump is fixated on. U.S. is actually exporting less and importing more than it was before the imposition of these mass tariffs. And of course, the issue of the constitutionality of these measures is now going to the Supreme Court. This week, SCOTUS has officially announced it is granting cert. It will be granting the review to the decision that came at a loss to the Trump administration. So we will see what will ultimately happen. But while the litigation is ongoing, unfortunately, the tariffs will remain in place, and the visa issue is entirely under the purview of the executive branch, with very limited function for the course of the legislature beyond specific reforms, which are unlikely to happen so long as the Congress is under Republican control. There has been a tightening of the visa issues all around. It's not just India that's a target. However, the impact on India, such as the cuts, the elimination of third-party applications, has been disproportional towards India, because India has used that method to circumvent extremely long queues inside the country, and the reduced staffing at the U.S. embassy during and after COVID, which has not been fully restored. The waiting periods to get a visa to the U.S., whether it's a working visa or short-term visa, are quite extensive internationally, but especially in India, and it's quite burdensome. But the general idea for that particular measure is to eliminate fraud and abuse of the system, and to streamline the processing, and to be able to validate the records and the criminal history of the applicants quickly, thanks to institutional knowledge base in the home country. But of course, coupled with other visa restrictions, it looks to be punitive, because of, again, disproportionate way it affects some countries such as India over others. And we are seeing that there are concerns about restricting student visas in particular are also backfiring, because Indians, and not just Indians, other countries too, increasingly see it as an issue of nativism, racism, discrimination has nothing to do with the limited visa fraud that some jobs do in order to avoid paying high salary to qualified American workers. This is across the board. Student visas have nothing to do with that. And none of that fraud is at a scale that needs massive changes to the current situation. So the impact is likely to be that India will likely recommend its students to and workers to apply for universities and jobs to other countries that do not have that problem, and that will leave that will deprive US of very talented professionals and student bodies. I think it will be an economic loss for the US most of all. I think the Indian students can find other countries with prestigious universities and good working opportunities, but US, although it has a fairly big market, is also its economy is shrinking as a result of all these measures. So it's going to be the big loser if this trend continues. In the meantime, US has something else to worry about besides the India-China rapprochement, which is the emergence of the China, Russia, and North Korea triumvirate closer than ever. We have seen this dynamic at the military parade that happened right after the SCO. Kim Jong-un of North Korea traveled to China for that parade for the first time in years, signifying a major breakthrough for North Korea, which came away from this meeting strengthened diplomatically, with China promising to open doors for it on the international stage, and Kim becoming less and less isolated and more as being seen as more influential, particularly in terms of providing Russia with weapons. 40% of Russian weapons are now and other equipment is now coming from North Korea. So none of that is particularly great news. How bad of a news will depend on whether all these startups and weapons, high-tech weapons debuted at this event actually turn out to be functional and legitimate, or is it more of essentially boasting for the sake of impressing the international community, but not really functional or tested? All of that remains to be seen.
Absolutely. And talking of this whole new alliance between China, Russia, and North Korea, what does it mean for the world, Irina?
Well, it means that we can expect a lot closer coordination between those three countries. China has already said that it will not let Russia lose the war. One of the reasons why it doesn't want to let Russia lose the war is because the war in Ukraine is a great distraction from Taiwan and China's other ambitions in the region. So we can expect China to become more aggressive locally, to cause more problems for its neighbors and rivals, and to advance its own objectives with the assistance of Russia and North Korea in various ways. Just how much help Russia can count on from China remains a big question, but it's probably going to be more than it used to be and more than what anybody would like to see. The fact that North Korea is being normalized and is actually emerging as a semi-legitimate international player is a scary thought. Nobody considers Kim even remotely rational, predictable, or stable in any way. This is not the sort of personality anyone wants to see gaining bigger international platforms, and yet here we are.
Absolutely, absolutely. Here we are. And from here, let's go to understand this political instability, political developments in several countries at the same time. In Japan, there is this whole PM change. Then we got France, we got UK. A lot of political developments happening at these places. How should we understand what's happening down there?
Well, I have to say a lot of it has to do with really poor leadership. And all of these countries are under stress from various factors: economic, political instability. The roots, while some of the reasons are different, the roots are structurally similar. Japan is facing a leadership transition shaped by anemic growth, demographic headwinds, and defense modernization needs. Japan is facing a major crisis with the loss of political seats from the ruling party over the questions of dependency on the international community, over whether or not it should nuclear go nuclear, and not just in terms of civilian energy, but in terms of pursuing a nuclear weapon as a matter of self-defense. The Prime Minister's decisions to step down concentrates factional bargaining within the ruling party, forcing choices on fiscal stimulus, tax reform, and defense outlays that are basically have been delayed long enough. Whether the party continues with its current trajectory, or whether there is a radical departure from its positions, will affect a lot of Japan's relationships as well as its own economic direction. In the UK, major cabinet reshuffle is both a management tool and a risk. It follows resignation of one of the minister's home secretary after a corruption scandal related to the purchase of a personal flat. Fresh faces can certainly reset momentum, but they can also expose fault lines between campaign promises and governing constraints. We are seeing that there is a lot of social upheaval over local policies, such as asylum seekers overwhelming the current capacity in a stagnant economy, essentially being assigned to hotels and causing friction with the locals, and especially in smaller towns. So the migration issue is a major factor in all of this. Defense capacity in light of very directed Russian threats, that is causing a risk. The fact that the economy is really not growing, the issues with green energy, and whether or not to continue on that course, which many consider suicidal for UK in the way it's being conducted. All of these factors are putting a lot of stress and a lot of pressure on the Starmer government. Public services, of course, are yet another issue. And there are no quick wins towards any of them. Reshuffle without policy delivery can contribute to the growing cynicism that's pushing voters in the direction of minor parties, including liberal Democrats that have been gaining seats, but also more controversial parties such as Reform Party, which itself has splintered over internal leadership and policy differences. Bold moves carry political costs, and Starmer has been excessively cautious, but has now promised a bolder direction on migration. The test is whether the new team will unblock planning reform and crowding private investments that the UK badly needs. So far, they are trying to come to arrangements with Saudis and assorted other countries, but excessive dependence on foreign investment is not great either. And so far, it has contributed to improved infrastructure and industry growth. It has not actually improved the economy. Meanwhile, in France, the government crisis, which resulted in the resignation of the ousting, I would say, the loss of the no confidence vote for the prime minister, and the appointment of the 39-year-old outgoing defense minister to that position, is due to the very fragmented assembly and street level mobilization capacity, and a great deal of social dissatisfaction with the Macron policies. And there is fiscal consolidation, there is managing social expectations, there is industrial strategy by France at odds with European fiscal rules. It's been very difficult to pass any serious bills on security, housing, or energy. Investors are demanding higher risk premium. Unions are leveraging the critical situation in their own interests. There's been a paralysis that ultimately ended in this crisis, and the efforts to pass major reforms were really did not go well. So there's increasingly less public patience in political economies for change. Demographics, debt loads, transition costs in energy and defense are leaving very little room for error. The public expects the governments to act quickly, decisively, and to get it right. There's also very little patience for austerity measures in any sort of economic downturns and limitations. The leaders are being forced into trade-offs that anger key constituents. That pressure leads to fracturing in party management, in reshuffles, resignations. It's not so much a crisis of democracy, but a crisis of expectations, meeting exceptional hard constraints, poor leadership, undecisive leadership, and also social polarization. Slower decision cycles, greater sensitivity to shocks, openings for external actors to test red lines and offer deal sweeteners, whether through domestic parties or external offers. There's incentives for bureaucracies to assert continuity and not really visible innovation. Whether any of these changes ultimately lead to any improvements remains to be seen, but I think a lot of these crises in all three countries go beyond any particular one leader. I think some of them are structural and systemic and require a radical re-evaluation of the entire direction of those countries and the focus of their energies and the focus of their policies.
Absolutely, absolutely. A lot of things happening in the world, and we'll keep coming to you to make sense of it all that is happening. With this, it's a wrap on this very special edition of The World According to Irina Tsukerman on the KAJ Masterclass Live. Thank you so much indeed for joining us.
Thank you so much. Appreciate it.